Okay, well, thank you, Stephen, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here at my alma mater in Canberra. And I've given a number of lectures at the ANU, most recently as the inaugural Consul-General and Senior Trade Commissioner in Houston, Texas. I'm now the Australian Consul-General in New York, and I cover 12 states and territories which have a combined gross state product of about $5 trillion, or 7.2 trillion Australian dollars, which is larger than the economy of Germany and around 4 times the GDP of Australia. In this lecture, I'm going to be all through US dollars. For those mathematically minded, multiply by 1.5, and you've got Australian dollars. Now, living in the United States is very different from visiting the country as a tourist. And when Australians arrive in Los Angeles or New York on holiday, comparisons are inevitably made between how much cheaper it is to buy goods such as clothing, footwear, sporting equipment, and even motor vehicles in the States. Some question, well, why can't Australia be more like America? Your money seems to go much further there. And we see the US as a much larger version of ourselves, with economies of scale resulting in cheaper consumer products and the delivery of more efficient services such as Amazon. Further, we are somewhat baffled about the divisive and polarised environment in the US, given our assumptions about how Australia-like it is. Some of us tend to think of the States as a huge middle-class society with upward mobility, albeit more inequality. The seemingly better partisanship in Congress, the Trump presidency, and debates over Obamacare somewhat jar with our intuitive understanding of the States. Now, over the next 12 months, the world will once again witness a titanic and incredibly expensive presidential campaign, pitting a large number of Democratic hopefuls against a powerful, combative, and highly resilient Republican incumbent. It's a fine spectacle, consuming tens of thousands of hours of media time, endless speculation about its outcome, and a winner-take-all ending. My lecture today, entitled Elephant in the Room, is not about the next 12 months or even the next 5 years. It's about the fundamental fiscal, debt, and related social challenges which will confront the United States over the next 3 decades. These challenges are unprecedented in American history and may profoundly shape the core of its financial, political, and social compact. Now, the seeds of this potential upheaval have been known to policymakers and political leaders since the beginning of this century. But the can has been kicked down the road for almost 2 decades. The longer this continues, the more drastic the policy reform that will be required to address the situation. As I will show in this lecture, if the current trajectory continues unabated, major fiscal ramifications will begin to manifest themselves in the United States in the next 10 to 15 years. Today, I will outline these impending challenges, look at what would happen if the status quo is maintained, and consider how Australia's own reforms could serve as a model to American policymakers as they assess potential structure and legislative alternatives. It is our national interest that the US remains the world's premier open market economy, maintains its defence capabilities, promotes the democratic values that our countries share, and in order to do this, America will need to find the political will to confront the elephant in the room, that is, its fiscal deficit and debt outlook. Now, in order to better understand the current and future state of US public finances from a federal, state, and local government perspective, I will first explain some important terminology and concepts about the US budgetary system. In Australia, the public budgeting process is undertaken on an annual basis, covering all items of government expenditure. In the United States, the federal budget is bifurcated into mandatory spending and discretionary spending. Mandatory spending encompasses financial entitlements for citizens that are enshrined in existing legislation and is not reliant on specific appropriations passed by the Congress. These entitlements are primarily demand-driven programs such as Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid. Discretionary spending items must have specific funds appropriated by Congress. It includes defence, education, housing and allocations to most government departments. The so-called US government shutdowns in fact only impact discretionary spending items, important as they are. Now, as you can see, mandatory spending is $2.5 trillion or 12.5% of GDP, roughly double the level of discretionary spending at 6.2% of GDP. Of note is US defence spending of $620 billion, which makes up roughly half of all discretionary spending. And on top of this, interest payments on government debt are currently 1.6% of GDP. In total, US government outlays amount to over $4 trillion or 20% of GDP. Now let's turn to the three major entitlement programs: Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid. Social Security, which is chiefly funded through a payroll tax, is the major federal entitlement program for retired Americans. It's funded through payroll tax that go into a designated general pool called the Social Security Trust Fund. It is this trust fund, rather than general tax revenue, that actually funds Social Security entitlements. In a similar vein to our superannuation system, there are other mechanisms for retirement savings in the US. Individual retirement accounts, IRAs, and 401k plans. However, the savings derived from these alternative retirement savings mechanisms are skewed towards those in the top 10% of income earners. In addition to Social Security, the other major entitlement programs for retirees and low-income Americans are Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare, which is funded solely by the federal government, provides subsidised healthcare coverages for Americans aged 65 and over. It's important to recognise that unlike Australia, the United States does not have a universal healthcare system, which I'll turn to later. Medicaid, which provides subsidised healthcare coverage for low-income Americans, is primarily funded by the federal government, but with state governments contributing almost 40% to the program. In Australia, Medicare is publicly funded through revenue raised by the Medicare levy and general revenue. Individuals may also purchase private insurance, which is also government subsidised, with the private system providing an all-important supplement to the public system. In the US, private health insurance contributions are primarily made by employers, with employees or individuals contributing by way of co-payments under their healthcare plans. The cost of healthcare is such a major issue in the US that one of the first things employees ask when seeking a new job is the specifics of the healthcare plan of their potential employer. Further, when employees retire or lose their jobs, they quickly lose their company-sponsored healthcare benefits, which is why Medicare and Medicaid are so important. Despite these various programs, 1 in 11 Americans has no healthcare coverage at all. For OECD countries, this is only exceeded by Greece. Now that I've summarised the major entitlement programs, let's turn to the major topics of this lecture. The current, state and future trajectory of US federal government deficit and debt, the current and projected cost of the American healthcare system, the fiscal outlook for individual US states, the changing distribution of American income and wealth, long-term implications for the US economy and financial system, and Australian policy innovations relevant to US policymakers. Now, to measure indebtedness, economists use net debt, or debt held by the public. That is the total stock of outstanding debt, less amounts that are held by other federal government agencies who hold it for investment purposes. For example, the Social Security Trust Fund that I've already mentioned is a major holder of US Treasury securities, which will be used to fund future Social Security entitlements. Net debt excludes these intergovernmental holdings. At the conclusion of World War II, the US had an all-time high net debt of over 100% of GDP, a result of large deficits which were used to fund wartime expenditures. This level of debt declined significantly over the following decades as the country transitioned to a peacetime economy. From the 1960s to 2008, net debt remained in the range of 30 to 50% of GDP. Since 2008, deficits aimed at mitigating the impact of the global financial crisis, which is known as a Great Recession in the US, have again led to net debt increasing to levels only seen immediately following World War II. Now, driven by ageing population and expected increase in healthcare costs, this deficit is projected to expand over the next 30 years. The current baseline projection by the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, projects that federal government outlays will increase from 20% today of GDP to almost 30% of GDP by 2050, with only a modest rise in federal government revenues. By 2050, the annual revenues to outlays gap, also known as the budget deficit, is forecast to be 9% of GDP. While there's significant uncertainty around these projections, the story is clear. The projected deficits will result in a further increase in federal government debt. Under the CBO baseline forecast, federal government net debt will almost double from 79% of GDP today to 144% of GDP by 2050. The CBO's baseline projection assumes that certain elements of the tax cuts which were passed by the Congress in 2017 will roll off by 2027 in accordance with the legislation. If these tax cuts are extended beyond 2027, in accordance, tax revenues will be lower, leading to larger deficits and increased borrowing to fund them. Under this scenario, the CBO projects net debt to GDP increasing to around 220% by 2050. So why is the Congressional Budget Office, a non-partisan federal agency, projecting the US federal debt to grow at such a rapid rate? Are there any undergraduates in this room who were born in 1997? Boy, you must be as old as me then. Well, if you were, let's just say that you were, according to the World Economic Forum, you're expected to live to 100 years of age. So the interaction of the demographic trends with the fact that defined social security and healthcare entitlements have been written into law is driving the trajectory of federal budget deficits and debt. A wave of American baby boomers are reaching retirement age. As a result, the percentage of Americans aged 65 and above and thus entitled to receive Social Security and Medicare benefits, has begun to rise steeply and will continue to do so for the next 2 decades. As the percentage of retirees in the population grows, the relative number of workers who contribute to Social Security payroll tax declines. This is measured through the support ratio, which compares the number of Americans aged 15 to 64 with those aged 65 or above. In 1960, there were 6.5 Americans of working age for each retiree. By 2030, there will be only 3 Americans of working age per retiree. This demographic dynamic is being played out across the world, especially in China. Now, I noted earlier that contributions to the Social Security Trust Fund were made by a specific payroll tax. Historically, a high support ratio meant that more payroll taxes were being contributed to the Social Security Trust Fund by working Americans that were being withdrawn by retirees. Because of these historical surpluses, the Social Security Trust Fund has built up a savings pool amounting to $3 trillion. With the movement of baby boomers into retirement, this is now changing. In 2019, Social Security payments to retirees will exceed payroll tax receipts for the first time since 1982. Outlays are forecast to exceed receipts for the foreseeable future, and a system will begin to denude the trust fund in order to meet this shortfall. According to the trustees of Social Security, the current $3 trillion balance in the trust fund will be exhausted by 2034. The Congressional Budget Office forecasts this will occur 3 years earlier in 2031. Without any legislative changes to Social Security, such as increasing the entitlement age or the imposition of means testing, ongoing revenues from payroll tax will only be sufficient to pay 80% of current benefits once the trust fund becomes insolvent in 2031. This impending retirement crisis has not gone unnoticed on Wall Street. One of the world's largest and most successful private equity firms is the New York-based Blackstone Group. Its founder, Stephen Schwarzman, has an estimated net worth of $16 billion. Tony James, the firm's executive vice president, has recently co-authored a book entitled Rescuing Retirement. Rescuing Retirement notes that the median retirement account balance for Americans aged between 40 and 55 is $14,500. Less than 4% of the $375,000 the median income worker will need in savings. The book states, as the US population continues to simultaneously grow and grey, elderly people living in depredation become a progressively greater share of the population. This wave of old Americans will strain our social safety net programs and devastate federal, state and local budgets. Left unaddressed, poverty among the elderly could drive up federal income tax rates by 10 percentage points. The World Economic Forum estimates that the United States had a $28 trillion retirement savings gap in 2015, the largest in the world. By 2050, they project this will grow to $137 trillion. This is almost a $3 trillion annual increase, 5 times the annual US defence budget. It should be noted the US is not the only country with a retirement savings gap. In fact, the World Economic Forum estimates that by 2050, the global retirement savings gap will be over $400 trillion, and even Australia is not immune from this problem. get into the US healthcare system. Within the OECD, the US healthcare system is so unusual, it warrants a brief history lesson. Up until the Second World War, the American public largely paid its own medical costs, with the exception of workers in certain dangerous industries such as mining, steel and railroads, who had access to company doctors or union-operated infirmaries. Private health insurance was almost exclusively obtained by individuals. During and after the Second World War, policymakers were concerned that the rampant inflation caused by the war effort and the federal government deficit would undermine the domestic economy. Legislation was introduced to limit wage rises, and consequently, employers began to offer company-sponsored healthcare plans which circumvented this legislation and further did not count as income for the purpose of determining income or payroll taxes. As such, by the 1960s, employer-sponsored healthcare was the cornerstone of the entire American healthcare system. This severely impacted workers who retired or workers with low-income jobs, who had no access to these healthcare plans. And in response, in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson established Medicare and Medicaid. And despite subsequent efforts by President Nixon, Clinton and Obama to reform these entitlement programs, the US healthcare system has largely remained unchanged since the time of Johnson. Healthcare in the US is the most expensive in the world. In fact, healthcare expenditures as a percentage of GDP are almost double those of Australia. By and large, when Americans retire or lose their jobs, they lose their employer-provided healthcare entitlements. And unlike Australia, there is no Medicare safety net. It is almost unimaginable in Australia, but completely the case in the US, that a medical emergency could result in personal bankruptcy. In fact, more than half of all bankruptcies in the United States are due to medical expenses not covered by insurance, or workers losing at least 2 weeks of work because of illness. In order to understand this at a more personal level, I thought I would share some anecdotes. When we moved to New York 2 years ago, my fiancée actually accidentally dropped a sofa on her foot. We took her to a nearby hospital at 8 a.m, where an X-ray confirmed a compound break in 2 of her toes. She had an operation which took 45 minutes and left the hospital at 5 p.m. In other words, she was a day patient. The bill, which was covered by insurance, came to $30,000. Had she not had insurance, the bill would have been far higher because the health insurance companies and hospitals undertake party-to-party negotiations which are completely opaque to the patient. Catherine Martin, the 4 times Academy Award winner and wife of film director Baz Luhrmann, told me about a similar experience with her mother, who developed an illness while visiting her in New York. Her mother was hospitalised for 10 days and the bill came to $250,000. Fortunately, most of this was covered by travel insurance. So let's look at something a little bit more mundane. A visit to a general practitioner in New York. Here's an excerpt from an insurance statement about a 15-minute consultation only taken a few months ago. As you can see, the amount billed by the doctor, physician, was $400. However, there was also a surgeon costing an additional $800 who wasn't actually present or consulted at all, but available in case of need. This was not disclosed to the patient during the consultation. The $1,200 bill for the 15-minute consultation, however, was discounted by 85% through a party-to-party negotiation between the doctor and the insurance company Cigna, which was not disclosed or known prior to the consultation. The net fee of $176 was then within the agreed terms, unique to the company-sponsored healthcare plan negotiated by my employer, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Now let's extrapolate this on a nationwide scale. There are millions of corporations in the United States, most of which have their own company-sponsored healthcare plans. There are 130 million private sector workers interface with nearly 900,000 active doctors across the country, with costs determined through party-to-party negotiations between the healthcare plan sponsors and individual doctors. On top of this are government sector workers with their own healthcare plans. The system is mind-boggling in its complexity. A 2014 study by Health Affairs found that administrative costs in the US amounted for 25% of all hospital expenditures, compared with 15% in England and 12% in Canada. Given the cost of medical care, it is not surprising that the number of Americans who say they have put off treatment over the past year for a serious condition because of its cost has almost doubled from 11% in 1991 to 19% today. Another key driver of the cost of healthcare is the cost of pharmaceuticals. Australia has the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme, in which the Commonwealth is a monopoly purchaser of all pharmaceuticals. This not only results in significantly lower drug prices than those available to Americans, who on average spend 3 times as much as Australians, but also ensure that every Australian is treated equally. In the US, the cost of pharmaceuticals to patients is determined by individual healthcare plans and party-to-party negotiations. Over the past 50 years, US healthcare expenditure has risen from 6% of GDP to 18%. Compounding this, American healthcare costs are projected to rise at more than twice the average rate of wage growth to 19.4% of GDP by 2027. Now, one would expect that with these healthcare costs, there'd be a commensurate benefit in terms of number of doctors, nurses, and hospital beds per capita compared with the rest of the world. However, this is not the case. In fact, according to the American Medical Association, Australia has superior metrics on all of these fronts, and Australians have a life expectancy than American citizens. The projected increase in healthcare costs will create significant financial stress for Medicare and Medicaid. The growth of Social Security outlays over the next 3 decades is in fact relatively modest compared to the trajectory of federal spending on healthcare programs. Major reforms to the US healthcare system will be needed within the next 15 years to avoid an unsustainable increase in Medicare and Medicaid costs. Now, up until now, we've only looked at the federal government deficit and debt, including the impact of rising healthcare costs. However, individual state and local governments also have their own deficit and debt profiles. These are being impacted by the same dynamics as seen at the federal level. Unlike Australia, states in the US do impose their own income tax on top of federal tax. Further, some municipalities, such as New York City, impose additional city taxes. Despite this, many have not set aside sufficient funding for the pension and healthcare entitlements of their public sector employees. As a result, almost all American states and municipalities have significantly unfunded liabilities, and in some cases these are extraordinary. The US Federal Reserve calculates that the shortfall in public sector programs at the state and local level is $4.2 trillion. Using a different methodology, Moody's Investor Services estimates a shortfall of $4.4 trillion, while the think tank, the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, puts it at $6 trillion. This equates to a shortfall between 13 and 18,000 per resident. On top of the US federal debt, unfunded pension liabilities for states and municipalities represent an additional 30% of GDP. The national average marks considerable differences between individual states. ALEC looks at these different states and then compares them with, as a result, it compares them with gross state product. On this basis, while New York's deficit is 23% of gross state product, California's liabilities are over 40% of GSP. In fact, according to ALEC, half of all American states have unfunded pension liabilities over 30% of GSP, and a quarter have liabilities of over 40%. In addition to a looming pension funding crisis, individual states also face higher Medicaid costs in the years ahead. As noted previously, unlike Medicare, which is entirely funded by the US federal government, state governments contribute approximately 40% of Medicaid outlays. This portion of Medicaid, funded by state governments, is impacted by the same projected costs that's driving the US healthcare expenditures, which we already discussed. The growing value of these pension, healthcare and other liabilities is impacting the creditworthiness of individual states. The rating agency S&P notes that only 30% of American states have a AAA rating, including Texas and Florida. A number of states have only a single A rating, while Illinois, the fifth largest state by GSP, $880 billion, has been downgraded to BBB- by S&P, only one notch above a junk rating. Other at-risk states include New Jersey, Connecticut, Kentucky and Pennsylvania. Now, in case these ratings are seen as somewhat academic, it should be noticed the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico is already in bankruptcy, with a complex debt restructuring underway, which will result in substantial cuts to pension and other benefits for Puerto Ricans. This well may be a harbinger for other states and municipalities. Finally, the rating agencies are evaluating the deferral of important maintenance on key infrastructure assets. For example, in California, the problem is becoming so acute that S&P has said deferred maintenance will be an area of increased focus for its credit analysis. This is not unreasonable, given that California's former governor described the state's backlog of deferred maintenance as staggering. The ability of states such as California and New York to increase their tax base to cope with future pensions, healthcare and deferred maintenance liabilities has been seriously impacted by the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Prior to this, individuals could offset their federal tax bill by deducting state and local taxes. Now there's a cap of $10,000, which is actually relatively low for taxpayers in the top bracket. This is particularly relevant for high taxing jurisdictions. For example, while Texas and Florida do not impose either state or city income taxes, residents of New York City in the top bracket pay an additional 12.7% in personal income tax, comprising 8.8% of state income tax and 3.9% in city taxes on top of their federal taxes. In California, residents pay 13.3% in state taxes on top of their federal taxes. Now, residents can escape these future tax implications by transferring to another state. This is already happening with businesses and individuals moving out of high taxing states to low taxing states. This is clear from the census data showing that domestic migration during 2017-18, it showed net domestic migration out of 180,000 residents from New York and 156,000 residents out of California in 1 year. In the same year, net domestic immigration inflows to Texas were 83,000 people and to Florida 133,000. This trend well may be exacerbated if and when the federal government is required to impose new taxes to cover its own Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid obligations. High taxing states such as New York and California face a negative feedback loop in which high income earners move to lower taxing states such as Florida and Texas, resulting in a narrower tax base and a higher per capita expenditure burden. Now, while the substantive issues of pension and medical entitlements arising from an ageing population is still not in front and centre of US political discourse, that of income and wealth inequality is certainly the topic du jour, and for good reason. Over the past 50 years, there has been a shift in the stratification between the top 5% of income earners who have seen real incomes nearly double compared with the negligible change for those in the bottom 60%. This bottom 60% can be further dissected into quintiles. It shows that real wages for the bottom two quintiles are particularly low, and those with the lowest incomes have benefited the least from aggregate economic growth over the last 50 years. This distribution of wage growth is indicative of a decline in upward mobility. Harvard economist Ray Chatty has found that the percentage of children who grow up to earn more than their parents has fallen from 90% in 1970 to around 50% today. While there are many reasons for this change, a key aspect is the quality and affordability of the US education system. Firstly, it's important to note that funding for public schools is largely sourced from local property taxes, which are on top of federal, state and city taxes. Naturally, the value of properties housing lower income families are considerably less than those housing the top 5%. As such, there has been a bifurcation between the haves and the have-nots with respect to accessing both school and university education systems. Since 1975, confidence in the public education system has plummeted, while over the same period, the cost of elite private education has increased at a much higher rate than wages. These elite schools are important feeders to Ivy League universities, which are not only critically important from an educational perspective, but almost as important from a personal network and social class perspective in a way that's simply not a feature in Australia. Let's turn to the costs of an undergraduate tuition at the Ivy League schools. Tuition and fees for a standard 4-year undergraduate degree, this is US dollars, is $220,000. This does not include living expenses, which adds an additional $80,000. Despite this, these schools receive a high number of applications but have low acceptance rates, reflecting their importance not only from an educational perspective, but the social cachet they bring. The college admissions bribery scandal, which broke in March, shows the extreme measures that some parents and students are willing to take to get into these elite colleges. While the Ivy League schools represent the top end of the market, the cost of university education in general has increased markedly over the past 40 years. As as these costs have risen, so too has the amount of student debt. Student debt has increased fivefold over the past 15 years. It has overtaken both credit card and automotive loans as the single largest form of consumer debt in the US. Nearly 70% of college students take out student loans and graduate with an average debt of $30,000. 11.5% of student loans are either now 90 days past due or in default, despite the economy being at full employment. Despite these default rates, this behaviour is economically rational. We've observed that income growth in the US is concentrated in the top 5% of earners. Given that not having a college degree almost guarantees being permanently locked into low wages, borrowing even large amounts to finance a college education does at least create the potential to earn high wages and generate superior wealth creation. In fact, the change in income distribution in the US over the past 50 years is more than matched when compared with change in wealth distribution. While the economy has had a decade of growth, the benefit of this has actually been concentrated in a relatively small cohort of the population. The US Federal Reserve estimates that the total wealth of all American households is $109 trillion. And the difference here, there's some things with not-for-profits, but it's $109 trillion. The wealth of the top 1% of the population is more than the combined wealth of the bottom 90%. The bottom 50% of citizens have close to no net assets at all, the result of their shouldering relatively high levels of mortgage and consumer debt. This level of inequality has worsened in the past 4 decades, with the share of wealth held by the top 1% of citizens nearly doubling from over 20% in 1978 to around 40% today. This level of inequality mirrors that of the 1920s, just prior to the stock market crash and subsequent depression. This wealth distribution is quite different to Australia. Although the average wealth per adult is not dissimilar between Australia and the United States, in the US this is skewed towards the top 10% of citizens. As such, the median Australian has 3 times the wealth of the median American. And our superannuation system has made a major contribution to this. In fact, for the median American, their wealth is more comparable to that of a Greek citizen. On a percentage basis, there are twice as many American citizens with wealth below $10,000 than there are Greeks. This compares with a relatively small 6% of Australian adults. In fact, a recent report by the US Federal Reserve indicated that almost 40% of Americans have less than $400 in savings available to cover an unexpected expense. The issue of income and wealth inequality is being discussed in earnest by a somewhat surprising group: Wall Street billionaires. Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater Associates, the largest hedge fund in the world, and with a net worth of $19.4 billion, recently released a report, Why and How Capitalism Needs to be Reformed. Dalio makes the point that most Americans in the bottom 60% of the population are actually poor, and the US has now one of the worst economic mobility rates in the world. Dalio states, it is now producing a self-reinforcing feedback loop that widens the income-wealth opportunity gap to the point that capitalism and the American dream are in jeopardy. The system is producing self-reinforcing spirals up for the haves and down for the have-nots, which are leading to harmful excesses at the top and harmful depredations at the bottom. Dalio concludes, "We are now at a juncture where either A, people of different ideological inclinations will work together to skillfully re-engineer the system so the pie is both divided and grown well, or B, we will have great conflict and some form of revolution that will hurt most everyone and shrink the pie." Ray Dalio has been joined by other wealthy Americans who are concerned about these income and wealth disparities will eventually lead to social conflict in the US. In June 2019, 18 ultra-wealthy Americans wrote an open letter to the 220 presidential candidates calling for a wealth tax to be imposed on the super rich. The impact of rising income and wealth inequality, the projected federal debt arising from Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid outlays, and unfunded pension liabilities will begin to seriously manifest themselves by 2030. Since the Second World War, the US has been the world's dominant economic power, which has conveyed unique benefits, including having a global reserve currency and a large military capability. In 1945, the US represented about 50% of world's GDP. It is now less than half of that. This downward trajectory is likely to continue over this century with the growth of China and India in particular. Measured during market exchange rates, China's GDP is projected to overtake the US by 2030. According to the IMF, China's economy is already larger than the US when measured on a purchasing parity basis. Irrespective of which methodology is used, the US economy is likely to continue to decline as a percentage of global GDP over this century. There are three questions arising from this dynamic. Can the projected US deficits actually be financed, or will there need to be a restructuring of the entitlement and tax program? Can the US dollar maintain its global reserve currency status? And lastly, can the economy sustain a military expenditure of 3% of GDP, given budgetary pressure from rising mandatory spending claims? Now, while the second and third question involved a great deal of speculation, we can at least look at the first question with some specificity. So let's just recapture where we are. The CBO's current baseline projection for federal government outlays grows from 20% of GDP to 30% of GDP by 2050, with only a small increase in revenue over the period. This will mean rising fiscal deficits going to 9% of GDP annually, and net debt doubling from 79% of GDP today to at least 144% of GDP by 2050. And on top of this are unfunded pension liabilities of state and local governments, which are around 30% of GDP. It's important to note that the CBO forecasts are simply entitlement projections and do not imply that these deficits can actually be funded by the US government. Further, the CBO assumes that the status quo of low funding costs, but even so projects that federal government interest expenditure will increase from 1.6% of GDP to almost 6% by 2050. In other words, by 2050, 20% of the entire budget will be needed just to serve interest costs and outstanding debt. In August this year, Congress passed legislation to allow the US Treasury Department to increase its borrowing limits in order to finance both mandatory and discretionary expenditures over the next 2 years. In response, Republican Senator Paul Rand said, "This well may be the most fiscally irresponsible thing we've done in the history of the United States. The annual deficit this year will exceed 1.2 trillion. What is irresponsible is recklessly endangering our children and our grandchildren. What is irresponsible is binding our kids to this massive burden of debt. What is irresponsible is a Congress that believes they are Santa Claus and can be everything to everyone and everything is free. It is an open question whether the government can fund increasingly large deficits and debt without increasing taxes or reducing entitlements. Now, traditional economists argue that deficits need to be financed through financial markets, which will demand higher interest costs or even shut down entirely once a certain level of debt reaches a critical threshold. For example, during the recent European banking crisis, borrowing costs of Portugal, Italy, Greece and Spain, the pigs, increased substantially and many traders had a no pigs policy, requiring significant intervention from the European Central Bank. However, other economists such as former IMF Chief Economist Olivier Blanchard have pointed out that it's not just the amount of debt that's relevant, but what it's actually being used for. If debt is being used to finance critical infrastructure or productivity enhancing investment, then it can be justified. In other words, debt utilised to fix New York's subway system, roads and fractured bridges is productivity enhancing and leads to higher economic growth. The leading economist Paul Krugman has stated, "It is not at all clear why the US federal government debt should be an urgent concern for us right now." Another school of thought that downplays the rising level of US debt is modern monetary theory. MMT references John Maynard Keynes, who wrote in his book A Treatise on Money, that stated all modern states have the ability to decide what is money and to control its supply. His point is that a modern state can always repay its debt by printing money. Thus, in nominal terms, it can never become insolvent. In this way, the US is different to pigs in Europe, who will be beholden to the European Central Bank, which controls the centralised euro. Proponents of MMT point out that inflation over the past decade has been remarkably low despite accommodating monetary policy. They would argue that in a globalised world, trade and technological growth has reduced the cost of many goods and services, undermining the traditional relationship between monetary policy and inflation. In other words, the US can continue to fund its increased deficits and debt obligations without risking runaway inflation. Indeed, today, 17 trillion, or over 30% of debt globally, is actually yielding negative interest rates. However, most economists argue that a government that resorts to simply printing money to pay for deficits will lead to inflationary pressures and currency devaluation. It is fair to say that the majority of economists hold the more traditional view about deficits and debt, and there are clear examples of modern economies such as Zimbabwe and Venezuela that have relied on printing money to repay debt with disastrous consequences. Former Secretary of the US Treasury Larry Summers argues that MMT defies the law of arithmetic and states, "We won't have the reserve currency forever if we embrace a theory that all government debts can be paid by printing money." Finally, the Congressional Budget Office itself states that if the United States fiscal trajectory continues on its current path, this will, quote, increase the risk of a fiscal crisis. That is, a situation in which the interest rate on federal debt rises abruptly because investors have lost confidence in the US government's fiscal position. The CBA notes that if borrowing costs were even to be 1% higher than its current projections, US government net interest expense in 2050 would amount to 10% of GDP, as opposed to 6% in its baseline assumptions. Any increase in US government borrowing costs will also impact the non-government sector. Currently, non-financial corporate debt is around 9 trillion, or nearly 50% of GDP. Assuming the traditional economists are correct, the US will face an increasingly difficult borrowing climate from 2030 to 2050. If the US cannot borrow 9% of its GDP annually to fund its expenditures, then there are only two fiscal policy levers that can be utilised. One, increasing taxes, or two, restructuring current entitlement programs, given that it's mainly mandatory spending outlays that derive the deficit, that drive the deficit. The Treasury's 2018 financial report of the US government states that the present value of unfunded Social Security and Medicare obligations amounts to $97.7 trillion. This exceeds the state liabilities, exceeds Medicare. This number of 97.7 compares with the total wealth of all American households of 109 trillion as reported by the Federal Reserve. Without any changes to Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid entitlements, or an increase in personal income tax, a potential theoretical solution is the imposition of a wealth tax, as proposed by the US billionaires previously referenced. Now, whether or not a wealth tax of close to 90% was actually envisaged by this group, this is effectively what would be needed to fund the present value of current entitlements. Of course, I'm being highly theoretical here because even a modest wealth tax would result in asset diminution, transfers to low tax jurisdictions, and other economically rational behavioural responses. Other policy actions will need to target the source problem, which is the cost of entitlements, given that adults are living far longer than was envisaged when these programs were established. In terms of Social Security, policy actions could include increasing the retirement age, means testing of benefits, and removal of the cap on payrolls taxes for Americans earning more than $133,000 per annum. If implemented expeditiously by Congress, these actions would in fact solve the Social Security problems as noted by the CBO. Healthcare is a far more serious problem in terms of future budget outlays. However, there are also policy solutions here. As noted, the United States spends twice as much on healthcare costs as other comparable OECD countries, with no discernible benefits in terms of longer life expectancy or the better health of its citizens. A corporation facing a similar problem would in effect undertake a benchmarking study of competing healthcare and make the necessary adjustments. If the US reduced its healthcare costs in line with the OECD average of 8.8% of GDP, or even Australia's 9.2%, this would release huge economic resources and largely eliminate the cost burden of future Medicare and Medicaid outlays. In terms of individual states, unfunded pension liabilities, deferred maintenance expenditures, and Medicaid costs could be at least ameliorated by privatising state-owned assets such as airports, roads, ports, electricity infrastructure and the like. Robert Poole of the think tank Reason Foundation has estimated that asset recycling could release up to nearly $900 billion of capital to be spent on rebuilding America's infrastructure, but some of this could be gifted to state pension plans to partially offset their funding shortfalls. Now, one of the unexpected aspects of my position as Consul-General has been to explain to Americans our policy innovations over the past 3 decades, which neatly coincide with the fact that Australia has not had a recession in 28 years. A not uncommon meeting or dinner party conversation centres around how Australia has enjoyed 3 decades of high growth relative to the US and Europe and avoided the Great Recession. Now, clearly a floating exchange rate, high immigration, a flexible labour market and productivity gains have played a critical role in our economic performance. This should not hide the achievements of Australian governments in creating robust policy initiatives which are frankly of relevance to US policymakers as they confront mounting fiscal and social challenges. In terms of retirement, the significant flow of superannuation money to New York-based investment managers has clearly demonstrated the power and importance of Australia's superannuation sector. In short, the stock of Australian superannuation accounts is 2.8 trillion compared with our GDP of 1.7 trillion. This ratio of superannuation savings to GDP is the second highest in the world after the Netherlands. Australian policymakers are rightly now focused on ensuring the highest net returns to superannuants. This includes a new senior position at APRA established to oversee the sector. Further, as a result of the Royal Commission and Productivity Commission recommendations, it's inevitable the sector will experience rapid consolidation. But Australia has already solved the far greater problem of accumulation. This is what is needed in the United States if the nation is to break away from its reliance on Social Security to provide retirement incomes for the vast majority of Americans. In terms of healthcare, and without sounding unnecessarily jingoistic, the Australian healthcare system is a far superior model to that of the United States, as it provides comparable healthcare at half the cost to its citizens. The combination of Medicare, PBS, private health insurance, and a safety net ensures that our citizens do not go bankrupt due to unexpected medical expenses, nor change healthcare plans when they change jobs. Further, as a result of the specialist referral system by general practitioners, there's far greater specificity in healthcare evaluation and treatment. The US healthcare system will certainly be the subject of considerable debate in the upcoming federal election, with a number of Democratic candidates calling for a universal healthcare system. Whatever the result of the next presidential election, it is clear from the CBO that the system will have to change by 2030 if the US is to avoid an unsustainable ramp up in Medicare and Medicaid costs. For US states, Australia has taken action to explain asset recycling programs undertaken by state governments. In 2018, Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister, together with most of Australia's premiers, discussed asset recycling at the National Governors Conference in Washington, DC, an event spearheaded by Ambassador Joe Hockey. In fact, the Ambassador is bringing a delegation of American state governors to Australia later this year to further assist with the understanding of our asset recycling programs. Finally, thanks to a decade of Australian government budget surpluses under the stewardship of Treasurer Peter Costello, there's a political and social culture here that is supportive of the federal government's need to live within its means. Budget surpluses are seen by the body politic as the outworking of good policy, whereas deficits are not. It has to be said that American policymakers and lawmakers do not like to be lectured by other countries about how to do things better. However, I do believe that these same policymakers, as well as Wall Street billionaires, recognise that eventually the United States will have to confront its emerging deficit and debt fundamentals if it is to avoid potentially catastrophic social conflict between the haves and the have-nots. To summarise, it is absolutely in our national interest that the United States remains the world's premier open market economy, maintains its reserve currency status, its defence capabilities, and promotes the democratic values that we share. In order to do this, America will need to confront the elephant in the room, which is debt, its deficit and debt outlook over the next 3 decades. I believe Australia has a reputation, policy, intellectual property, and experience to play a constructive role in assisting the US as it works through these challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alastair. We have about 5 or 10 minutes for questions, so I think there's microphones roving around. So if you've got a question, please put up your hand, and somebody will be passed with the microphone. Yep, at the front there. Thank you.
probably two parts. I used to work for a British pharmaceutical company, and I had the opportunity once to speak at a buyer conference in the US, and I talked about the Australian healthcare system, and I got shouted down by my colleagues from the US pharmaceutical. So I think you don't want to underestimate the lobbying power of the US pharmaceutical industry. And then the second one is immigration, increased immigration within the US play any role in deferring the baby boomers' retirement? And I know that's a particularly political issue, not only increased immigration but also recognition of illegal immigrants so they start paying taxes and so on.
Funny you should mention about the pharmaceutical industry. I had a dinner party with some people who were developing new pharma products, and obviously the Australian system. They said, well, you don't understand that the US really funds the rest of the world. And I said, well, that's fine, but you can't go on doing this and bankrupt your own country to allow pharmaceuticals to develop the rest of the world. Secondly, I believe that, like anything in economics, if the cost to the Americans were halved, then effectively the pharma companies would work out different ways of doing it, and frankly they're buying a lot of new technology from innovators anyway. So I think the system, and frankly you can't afford to run a medical system that's twice the expensive of the rest of the world. And the second part of the question of immigration, yes, immigration is important and will assist, and it's assisting us, but this baby boom dynamic is basically, you can only tinker with it. The key thing is unlike Australia, is first of all there's been no money put away apart from retirement. If you look at the numbers there, you'll see the Social Security Trust Fund had 3 trillion, I think there's 30 trillion of obligations. So nothing's been done on that basis. And secondly, on healthcare, it's simply again this trajectory caused by the baby boomers. If healthcare was about the same cost as Australia, it would be manageable. Immigration has a role to play, as it has in Australia. We've done very, very well from immigration, as I noted in our own GDP, but it won't solve these problems. It is an entitlement problem that's been put in legislation that's a real problem.
So I was wondering, what effect will the unwinding of Obamacare have on the future liabilities for the healthcare system in the US?
We didn't want to get into specifics of the healthcare system is so complicated. I think if you had 100 supercomputers trying to work it out, you couldn't. We deliberately stayed away from Obamacare, etc., because in effect, if you look at the trajectory, where the US will be running 9% of GDP per annum, Obamacare is again just a tinkering with the system. So we stepped back from that because we think about if we discussed Obamacare, we sort of lose the audience. Obamacare, in order for this system to survive, it has to get its cost down by about half. And so whether Obamacare's in or out, it actually doesn't do that. As I said, other presidents should try to deal with this, but the system basically has got to be made Australia-like, and that's so far away from Obamacare right now.
Thank you for that very informative talk. Just building on from the gentleman's comments just before, how do you think what you've described there is also relating to some have observed the fundamental psyche in America of the survival of the fittest, that even entitlements, that the notion and the connotation of that is everyone really needs to earn their bread. How do you think that feeds into that? And secondly, how do you think policy or the policy narrative in the US at the moment can shape that or change that or maybe reinforce it?
I would say that in the US there's a tolerance for pain in terms of differences between wealth that's probably exceptional by world standards. Having said that, one of the things that is part of the social cohesion is people say, well, you may be worth $1 billion, I may be worth whatever, but I know when I retire I've got my social security, right? And no one really understands the fact that it's part of a trust fund. I had people working for me, and they would have no clue that in fact this money is going to run in 2030, it'll come as a shock. So part of the reason for yes, you're right to an extent, but people do say, well, there is this rainbow at the end, which is I've got my healthcare covered, So finally, when I turned 65, I got my retirement. So I'll put up with it. I'll put up with this, until then. If people said, actually, you're not going to get those things, and that's why I say 2030 is such an important point for the US. It's people basically say, you thought you were getting $2,000 a month. It's been cut by 20%. Now, the interesting thing about the CBO assumption, the baseline, is they actually don't reflect the cut of 80%. In other words, the CBO is saying it's politically possible to cut that expenditure by 20%. It'll have to come out of the deficit or future spending. So yes, America's got a bit more of a robust view about life on Earth than I would say Australians. On the other hand, people say, when I turn 65, she'll be right, and she is not going to be right. And that's the social conflict that these billionaires who are all in Wall Street are figuring out. But once people get told, you thought you had this, you don't, there's going to be enormous potential social conflict. Ray Dalio is one of the world's sort of 3 greatest investors. And for him to start talking about revolution is quite remarkable when you think about it.
Thank you so much for a very comprehensive presentation while you're down in Canberra. I'm a research student here at the ANU and previously worked downstairs from the consulate at the Commission. I'm going to go back to healthcare, but in a much more general term than what we talked about. What you talked about in terms of the net GDP spent in healthcare, which is quite excessive compared to other OECD countries. But at the same time, when we look at proposals and what you've talked about, they all take into account a much larger spend from the government, right? So whether you look at kind of universal healthcare, but what we've also seen is a major issue of Medicaid and Medicare spending in terms of its outlook on the public finances of the federal government. So how do we balance the issue of a highly increasing net deficit federally because of a lot of healthcare spending, but also proposals, and if you look at all democratic proposals from the candidates, they all take into account a much higher spend on the public side. So how do we kind of reconcile those two things?
They're irreconcilable. No one is saying right now that the system has to have what I would call a benchmark. So you're absolutely right that the proposal to have further spending, but again, the people who are voting, haven't had the benefits of interviews. I mean, what is remarkable about the lecture today is all these numbers are in the public domain. This is the Congressional Budget Office, etc. And I would have thought that by now, with only 10 years away, people would start talking about it. Now, what I would think is that the Wall Street investment class is starting to get quite nervous, and billionaires are getting quite nervous. But the people who are in factory jobs, etc., have no clue about this. So they say, "Yep, that's a good idea. I'd like to see increase in healthcare because it takes the burden off me." But no one's saying, "Well, actually, you can't even afford the existing system, let alone a new system." So they are irreconcilable.
Hi. Yep.
Oh,
Thanks for the lecture. And just given current US fiscal position, do you think that it is possible for the government and the politician to reform the education expenditure because its outcome will only be seen far in the future, and it is kind of a way to grow the pie instead of splitting the pie in a different way? Yeah.
No. I think that you have to understand that you might speak to a state governor about this issue of schools. And first of all, they're looking down at huge unfunded pension liabilities, deferred assets, etc. And so what you're effectively saying is that there needs to be a subsidy from people in the wealthier areas to people in the poor areas, which means more tax. And we've already seen in places like New York, I think, where that's becoming untenable. So the idea that people in Darien are going to start contributing to people in the Bronx, for example, I just don't think is viable. It could, and as I said, if the problems of the states weren't so acute, and this has been started 20 or 30 years ago. Now, what you'll see in the States is you'll see, individual billionaires come up with their individual programs or pet projects and say, look, I'll fix this school, whatever. But the idea that public schools are funded by property tax is pretty unusual anywhere in the world. And so what we're looking at here is a number of fixes that have to be done. And my gut feeling is that will be a low priority, even though you're intellectually correct. It should be the highest priority. I think that you then get to the local level, the state level, then you look at the federal level, etc. And it's just too complex.
Hi, Jennifer. I'm a final year student in Actuarial Studies and Finance, and I also work for the Australian Office of Financial Management. So obviously Australia is very reliant on the US fiscal policies and economics, and also China, and obviously we have the trade war going on at the moment, and with everything the US is doing, how do you think Australia is going to fare up as for the fact that we are reliant so much on them?
I'm going to answer that question next year when I'm retired as a diplomat, because I want to talk about that. I've been thinking about it a lot, about what we need to do as a country going forward. But I am constrained as a public servant. I will be unconstrained in 12 months. And you will get a lecture that will discuss that as well. But at the moment, can't say much about that, can't answer that question.
Great, so I think we've got maybe one question at the front. So who's got the microphone at the moment? Yeah, so maybe this question, one at the front, then I think we'll have to call it a day. Then Alastair's got to head off to a dinner, so if someone get the microphone. So yeah, you've got a question and down the front. Yeah.
So you were saying that the billionaire class is nervous. Have you seen any indication that markets are pricing in future tax increases in the US?
No, not at all. What's interesting, what you're seeing is people talk about moving to low state jurisdictions such as Florida. You're seeing a huge amount of Wall Street now talk about moving. But in terms of the market, you'd actually quite the opposite. With a third of all debt having negative yields, it's quite the opposite. So no, I'm not seeing this at all.
Is that unexpected?
Oh, it would be for me. Otherwise, if I gave the lecture and said it would be unexpected, I shouldn't give the lecture. At some point, this will happen. But the markets are kind of interesting. When you look at what happened with pigs, you could see these imbalances building up over 5, 10, 15, 20 years in the case of Italy. Not so much in Spain, that was different. And then one day the market goes, oh, S, and then it suddenly goes, no, pigs, etc. So, my own feeling about markets is they tend to sort of lag a bit because people talk about this, etc. But there comes a point where something clicks and markets react. So when I was studying at ANU, I believed in the efficient market hypothesis, etc. But actually, when you work in Wall Street and you see incredible inefficiency around the system, and then you see people will fund things, the junk bond market, etc., and suddenly goes pear-shaped. You would have argued the same thing about the mortgage crisis that happened 10 years ago, led to a recession when none of the stuff made any sense until one day it didn't. And suddenly it snapped. You could have argued, surely you would have seen that 10 years earlier. You could see what was happening, low doc and no doc, etc., etc. But nothing happened until it happened. And then when it happened, it really happened. That was quite Confucian, wasn't it?
I was going to ask, I come from one of those pigs, Ireland, and we seem to have picked ourselves up and got on with it. And we didn't have a revolution. But do you think if Americans actually realised how badly off they are? I mean, it's always been something that's intrigued me because so many Americans are of Irish descent. And they come back to a country like Ireland now, we're doing a lot better. So things can improve, but do you think there's any appetite for revolution? Because I've always thought if there's ever going to be a real revolution, it has to be in the US.
Well, I'm not going to quote, as a diplomat, revolution. I can only point to people like Ray Dalio. I would say that, the ECB and the rest of the world came into bailout Ireland if Ireland didn't have all that institutional help, it would have been in terrible trouble. So the ECB, other countries such as Germany, the UK, put money to the ECB to bail out, and they could because of the size. But if someone said you've got to bail out the entire Eurozone, well, who's going to do that but Europe? Now, of course, then you get back to sort of the whole printing money question. As I said, my gut feeling is that, I come back to my earlier comments, that people say, well, you know, I know I'm 65, I'll have my social security, I'll have my Medicare, and so, you know, I'll put up with it for now. And so I think when that starts changing entitlements, the discussion really comes around entitlements, then I think you're going to see some issues. So Ray Dalio, interested for these billionaires, is not the only one to talk about revolution either. There are other people talking about it. Now you might say, look, it's a little bit of linguistic prose, etc. But I think there's genuine concern when the vast majority of the population that hasn't got retirement incomes that we have, where they can look up and say, you know, that's how much money I've got in my super, are told that actually, you know, you won't be able to have the sort of healthcare you thought, or retirement incomes. And that's why I think, you know, 2030 is going to be a very interesting time. Now, there are policy solutions to this. It's just a question of the political will and discourse to actually do it.
Great, thank you very much, Alastair. I'm very pleased you mentioned the strength of the public service in Australia. I think at the college, one of the things we take seriously is, I guess, the obligation to educate students well, and hopefully many of them will go into the public service to ensure its strength moving forward. Look, we do appreciate you coming back. I know this is your third public lecture, probably over the last fifth or the third. Well, I was aware of three, not the other two. But look, I'm very much looking forward to you coming back when you retire. No doubt that'll be a very interesting public lecture when you're able to speak unconstrained. So, you know, we welcome you back to the college next year or the year after. That would be fantastic. So, could you please join me in thanking Alastair again?